So actually last year I went and bought an iPad 3 and for some reason I never made a video about it, and right now when I actually open it up again and I open my drawer, I found out it was cracked, so I'm kind of salty about it, but I have two iPad 3s, so I guess it's okay. But the iPad 3 is a super interesting device because it was pretty much a successor to the iPad 2, like that kind of makes sense. But the weird thing is that it really wasn't a huge upgrade, and it was probably the most minor upgrade coming from one iPad to the other. In recent times that I can think of, I can't really think. I mean, going from the first iPad to the second iPad was a pretty big update, but then the iPad 3 to the iPad 2, it really wasn't that big of an update in my opinion. So we're going to be taking a look at it, seeing how it holds up in 2020. I guess there's some cool advantages for it still, but really, I mean, if you have a little bit of more money to spend, I wouldn't recommend getting an iPad 3. But if you currently own it, I mean, I guess there's no harm in keeping it either. Now, I want to say my opinion is not the end all be all, it's just my opinion, like I could be totally wrong with these things. So the iPad 3 came out in 2012, and looking on the front, I mean, it literally looks like any other iPad, but it's weird that this design, I mean, is still kind of current, and this thing was released almost 8 years ago, which is pretty crazy. And on the front, we still have that 9.7-inch IPS panel, and this type of panel has been used on every single iPad pretty much. There's not been an iPad with an OLED panel yet. But the weird thing is that, like I said, this type of design for the most part has been used even for the budget iPads this year or last year. Of course, with the iPad Pros, it's a little bit different. They totally removed the bezel, most of the bezel on it, which is really nice. And we should be seeing some more rumors and leaks coming out for the newer iPad Pros coming out this year, so that's going to be super exciting. And that resolution on the iPad 3's panel was 1536 by 2048, which is actually a pretty big and nice resolution panel, which is really nice. I mean, you look at panels nowadays and it's almost that same type of panel, so it's above that 1440p type of display, which is really cool. And I'm actually glad they actually put that into this device, and that might be one of the biggest advantages for this iPad actually, might be the panel itself. And like I said, there's still a lot of bezel around this panel. You have that front facing camera, which is cool. You have that home button, which some people might not like, but for the most part I think it's okay. I don't think people really care about it anymore. On the bottom you can see we have that old 30-pin connector, which eventually came out when they did switch back to the iPhone 5, you know, with that lightning port, which came out in 2012 actually. This year, it came out this year. And then the year after, it came out with the 5S and all those things. So this one was released before the iPhone 5, so it didn't get that lightning port connector. And on the back, you can see we have a camera sensor, which is awesome. And in terms of the way it feels, it literally feels like any other iPad in this day and age. I've owned some of the iPad 9.7 inches. I've owned the iPad Pro, the 2016 model, and really all my iPads feel exactly the same. And I can't really say the same thing about iPhones. You know, you hold some iPhones and the other ones, and some definitely do feel more premium than the other ones. You know, you look at like an iPhone 5 versus like an iPhone 10. I mean, both feel premium in their own way, but I definitely do side with the iPhone 10. But with the iPad 3, when I was holding this one and I was holding an iPad that might have came out in 2017 or 2018, like you don't notice that big of a difference. You only see the big of a difference obviously with like the squared edges with the iPad Pro, or when you're kind of sliding through things and the software and performance. That's when you see the biggest difference. But in terms of the way they feel, I mean, Apple made a really smart choice of making their iPads feel extremely premium. You look at Android tablets from 2012, like the Nexus 7 or something, and I've already reviewed those like 5 times. Those ones don't necessarily feel as premium as, you know, the iPad 3 does in 2020. So Apple knew what they were doing, and that's actually a really good thing. When you make a timeless thing, even 10 years later, it still feels pretty current, and that's something I really do like about Apple. And the fact that they made this feel this premium with this good of a display is a really good thing and a huge testament for Apple. So that really pretty much covers it up in terms of the outside. Now, hitting on the software, this is probably the most boring aspect of this device. This thing started off with iOS 5.1. We are able to get iOS 9.3.5 on it, which is really cool. But what I will tell you is that it's not getting any more software updates. But the weird thing is that this iPad stopped the same time as the iPad 2 in terms of software. So I don't really understand that. I feel like they should have extended this one a little bit longer since this thing came out, you know, after the iPad 2. But it is what it is. I guess we're not going to freak out about it too much. As far as I know, there were some jailbreaks out for this thing, so that's really cool. The fact that this thing is not getting software updates anymore is pretty bad. You know, it's definitely on the negative side. But still, if you want to get some use out of it, iOS 9.3.5 isn't extremely incapable of handling anything. A lot of the apps are still signed for iOS 9.3.5, so that's pretty decent. So how it holds up in 2020 is totally congruent. I haven't been saying congruent too much, but it's totally congruent to the software that it's on. If it was on iOS 8 or iOS 7 that it ended on, which it wouldn't have ended on in the first place, but if it did, that would definitely be a bad place for it to stop at, because those apps are not being signed anymore, and a lot of the apps that are needed kind of have to be on that iOS 9 to iOS 10 time frame. So it is what it is. But like I said, you can get jailbreaks out for the iPad 3, which is really cool. So you can easily go jailbreak this thing. It's not going to be an easy process, but it's definitely a needed one. If you're having an iPad that's this old, I would highly recommend you to jailbreak it or whatever the case is. So that really pretty much covers it up in terms of the software standpoint. Now hitting on the performance, okay, this thing was released with the Apple A5X chip, a dual core CPU, and there were 3 different models of the iPad 3, a 16, 32, and 64 gigabyte models, and all those models had 1 gigabyte of RAM. And what I can tell you about the performances is that it's more or less the same what you expect. It's actually not that bad of performance of an iPad for sure. I think one thing that kind of threw me off with this thing was that I was expecting it to be much faster than what it was, but at the same time, once I kind of started to understand that it is an older iPad, it really wasn't as bad as I thought. So if you're doing, obviously it's not comparable to even like an iPhone 8 in terms of performance, but if you're having something like this in 2020, I would assume it's something that, you know, probably got like as a hand-me-down or something, or like a person who just like found it or something, like, or got one for a cheap price. And in terms of that, I think it still has some capability for sure in terms of like web browsing, going through apps and going through websites and stuff. It definitely can handle its own, I think, for the most part. Even going like if you're using Safari and going through like different websites and keeping different websites in the background, I think it could definitely hold its own for sure. Even some minor games can definitely get you by, but like I said, when you go up to those upper apps and those apps that kind of take a lot of performance, it can definitely kind of take a toll in terms of the way things are going to be handling on your iPad. So once you start keeping a lot of those things in the back end, that's when things start kind of going down in terms of performance. So as long as you're not keeping like 50 apps in the background, I think you'll be okay. It does have that dual core processor, like I stated, which isn't that bad, but the A5X chip is kind of outdated for now. And, you know, we're on the A13 Bionic nowadays, so it's pretty crazy that this thing came out with the A5X. But what I can tell you in terms of performance is it's not horrible, but it's not good for, you know, being a 2012 device. I have to keep that in my mind. If you're planning on getting this thing, I mean, I would say it's like the iPhone 4S performance with a little bit more RAM. I think that's the best way I can put it. So that's probably how I would sum up the performance aspect for sure. Now hitting on the camera, like I stated, this thing has a single camera sensor on the back, a 5 megapixel sensor at that. You can shoot 1080p video on it, which is really, really cool. On that front camera, you have a VGA camera, and you can film in 480p at 30 frames per second, you know, a whopping 480p. But Apple knew that that front camera was basically only going to be used for FaceTime, so I don't think anybody's going to be using that iPad to make, you know, dedicated videos on or anything, but I'm sure people have. On that back camera, like I stated, 1080p at 30 frames, and I think it's a pretty decent sensor. It's nothing you're gonna go and like make videos about and depend on it for, you know, school projects or anything, but I think for the most part for now in 2020, I think it's a good side thing for only doing FaceTime calls. I really wouldn't use this iPad for anything else besides doing FaceTime calls, and even then the quality of those calls aren't going to be that great because of with that front camera being such a low resolution. So that is definitely a huge disadvantage for the iPad 3 for sure. So in terms of the camera, I give it like an average thing for being in 2020 and being released in 2012. But if this thing were to be released now in 2020, that would be a huge uproar. Like that would be a huge problem. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing has an 11,560 milliamp-hour battery, which is crazy. That is a humongous size battery for an iPad like this. And to kind of give you a perspective, this thing isn't crazy huge, like powerful or anything like that. It does have a pretty high resolution display, which could be, you know, one of its downfalls in the battery life. But because this thing isn't crazy powerful, it doesn't have a lot of background process. It's on iOS 9, which is what didn't really take up that much battery life to begin with, and that is a humongous asset for a tablet like this. And one of the coolest things about it is that the battery life can literally last you for so long. I'll give you an example. Even with my iPad 2 and my first iPad, whenever I charge those things up, it can go so long. It can go multiple weeks on standby time, and even me barely using it every once in a while, like it can last a very, very long time. And that is a huge thing for an iPad, especially for something like this. I mean, with the phone, I guess it's okay because you're planning on charging it all the time. But if you're going on road trips and stuff, you want to bring something with you that'll last multiple days. And, you know, with an iPad 3, that battery life is crazy. And even if that battery depreciated and degraded quite a bit, let's say it degraded like 3,000 milliamp hours, that's still like a 8 to 9,000 milliamp hour battery on this thing, which is a humongous battery still. So that's one of my favorite things about this iPad for sure. And to kind of sum up the video and to answer the question, dude, is the iPad 3 still worth it in 2020? I will say probably no. You know, for a majority of you watching this, I know I just hyped it up, but I would not recommend picking up an iPad 3 in 2020. I don't think it's worth the money. I don't think it's worth, you know, what you're going to spend on it. I think it definitely has some things going for it. Like, you know, You can definitely go and, use this thing as a multimedia device if you just want to play videos on it, or you just want to go to Safari and use some things. But for using it as like a productivity machine or using it for anything else besides basic capabilities, I would not recommend it. I mean, you can easily go and pick up like an iPad 2017 or 2018 model for like probably less than like $150, which I would 100% recommend you doing that. You can even pick up the iPad Pro 2016 model, which is the one I have, for probably like less than 120. So that's kind of what I would recommend. I really would not recommend people buying the iPad 3 in 2020, but if you're currently using it, I'd love to hear your experience down in the comment section below. But hit that like button if you guys enjoyed the video, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys would check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.